Okay, welcome again to the webinar, Insider Threats, Using Digital Forensics to Prevent the Theft of Your Valuable Intellectual Property. Depending on where you're calling in from, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. And it's a pleasure to have everybody here today. I think some people are still going to be joining the webinar, maybe a minute or two late. So no worries, this is going to be recorded and we will be sending this out afterwards to all the attendees or people that registered. So if you missed the first few minutes, it's okay. We're off to the races. So, okay. So I just want to introduce the two panelists today, myself and Ken. My name is Ryan Duquette, and I am the national leader and partner at the firm, and I'm the leader of the digital forensic practice. And also Ken Liu is going to joining us today as well, and he is a manager in the digital forensics practice today. And both Ken and I are former law enforcement as well, so I have a long history of digital forensics investigations, and we hope our content today is of value to you. Little bit of an agenda today. Ken is going to be jumping into the beginning and talking a little bit about what is digital forensics, because that's where we should start, right? Just sort of defining digital forensics and, when to involve a digital forensics expert into the process, some best practices for talking about evidence and forensically preserving evidence. And then I'm going to be jumping back in later on in the webinar to show you some case examples and actually talk about the theft of intellectual property. Little bit of housekeeping here before we get rolling. We've set aside, some time at the end of this for some questions and answers. To submit your questions, please click on the Q&A button near the bottom of your screen. If it's not showing up already, please click the three dots to expand that, and you'll see similar questions already asked, and you can upvote those questions as well. We did also have a bunch of questions pre-submitted in the registration, and we've gone through some of those and chosen some of those already. But if you have others, please do submit them. We're obviously going to try to address as many as we can in the time that we have, but in the event that we do run out of time, we wanted to follow up with you. So please do reach out, and we're going to give you our contact information. So please do reach out after the presentation if we don't answer your questions today. And as I mentioned before, lastly, this webinar will be recorded, and a copy will be provided to everybody within a few days of the event. Just a little bit of a disclaimer that we put in things here. This is just a general overview of the subject, and it's used for educational purposes. Obviously, if you have any other questions pertinent to a specific case or a specific matter that you're dealing with, best to reach out to us and have a conversation about that. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand things over to Ken to start talking about digital forensics.
Great, thank you, Ryan. So forensics in general refers to the use of the scientific method when applied to legal matters. So digital forensics is simply forensics that's applied to legal matters, whether it's civil or criminal, where something digital is involved, like a phone or a laptop that is relevant to the matter. Services we offer at MNP include investigations, for example, employee fraud, employee misconduct, IP theft, contractor shareholder disputes, wrongful dismissal, breach of appropriate use policy, fraud and financial crime investigations, and online defamation. For evidence collection, that means things like seizing of devices, data preservation, and cyber incident response, for example, collecting server logs. Data recovery, that refers to recovering deleted files, deleted photos, or deleted email, or anything that's deleted. Litigation support, so we can write expert reports, we can execute Anton pillar orders, so basically a civil search warrant. We can also act as expert witnesses or just review and interpret digital evidence for you. So when to involve a DF expert? As soon as it becomes clear that digital devices will be involved, it's best to get a DF expert on board for the following reasons. So to determine if it's a device that we can successfully handle, to suggest other potential sources of data, to provide guidance on how to seize the devices, and to set proper expectations on what we can expect to achieve. Common sources of digital data would be hardware like desktops, laptops, servers, tablets, so iPads, Surface Pros, Android tablets, smart technology, Internet of Things, or things like Google Home or Amazon Echo, otherwise known as Alexa, Mobile devices, so Apple's, Android smartphones, Blackberries, email, so Exchange Server, Office 365, Gmail, any kind of storage technology like hard drives, SSDs, optical discs like CDs or DVDs, also USB thumb drives and things like that. And of course, more important these days is cloud data. So like Dropbox, Microsoft, what is it called? Whatever their storage technology is, social media stuff, things like that. Okay, now that we've talked about the more common sources of data, the first steps in any investigation would be identification. So that's something that you, the business owner, will need to identify. We're not going to know in advance what devices you want us to seize. Device collection. So we should be collecting what you identified in a forensically sound manner and establishing a chain of custody. IT can collect some of the stuff like PST files or server log files, and MNP can collect others like hardware, like computers and laptops. But generally speaking, we try not to have IT image systems so that we can keep them out of any potential litigation. IT guys don't like being called into court. For data preservation, we will preserve the data by forensically imaging it with our tools. This usually involves making a bit-for-bit copy or an identical copy of the device data. So data that we can extract from a typical laptop will be things like address books, emails, calendars, connected USB devices. For web browsing, that means things like social networking data, web browsing history, or downloaded files. Documents such as like spreadsheets, databases, memos, photos, videos, audio files, and deleted files. Network information means things like the IP address, Wi-Fi hotspots, user account details, for example, when somebody logged into your computer, and when files were accessed, modified, or deleted. And with that, I'll pass the presentation over to Ryan, who will talk about some case studies and ways to mitigate IP theft. Ryan?
Great. Thanks, Ken, for giving us a rundown of digital forensics and what we can collect from devices. So again, I'm going to be talking specifically now about intellectual property theft and what we can do as digital forensic examiners to help prevent and also investigate IP theft. I recently had a chat with a friend who is a fairly senior at a large, well-known software company, and they obviously have some very significant intellectual property involved in their company. And someone at their company was being fired for cause, and my friend and some other coworkers suspected that he may take or may have already taken intellectual property from the business. And given their line of business, this was a concern. And I mentioned to my friend that digital forensic companies can take a look at an employee's computer or mobile device to try to see if, in fact, they are walking out the door with company data, and said that that was easier to deal with this type of thing before the person leaves rather than waiting until they're gone, and then potentially litigation ensues. So that my friend took this message to senior leadership of the business, and in return, an interesting yet possibly short-sighted message came back. We trust our employees not to take company data with them when they leave. And my feeling here is, potentially firing somebody for cause may or may not equal trust that somebody is going to do the right thing as they're walking out the door. Placing your trust in your employees is definitely an important factor for not only attracting but retaining talented individuals, and for encouraging a positive and collaborative corporate culture. We all know that. However, you need to verify what those employees are doing before they potentially walk out the door with your company valued property. And I'm not talking about staplers. President Ronald Reagan, while discussing US relations with the Soviet Union, famously would quote the Russian proverb, "Trust but verify." And when it comes to retaining valuable intellectual property, organizations do well to use that proverb as their mantra. So today we're going to go over a little bit of the background as to intellectual property theft, and then what can be done. Because I think it's, generally need to understand the landscape of, how employees take the data and when, and some other factors there. And then we'll jump into how digital forensics can help. So a little bit of the background that we're going to go over is the external threat versus the insider threat. Today we're definitely talking about the insider threat. What type of information needs protecting? What are the sources of intellectual property theft, the causes of intellectual property theft, and the timing of intellectual property theft, and some examples as we go through things today. So from an external threat, and the range of threat actors externally are diverse. And the landscape and options are constantly, growing and changing. We think of all the different ransomware attack, groups that are out there, and all the different external threats that our organizations have to deal with. So knowing what and who to combat is very, very important from a cybersecurity perspective. And there are 4 main groups of these known threat actors. There is hacktivists, people that are trying to hack into our devices and disrupt our data. There are nation state attacks that we have likely heard of in the news. There are criminals that are doing this for gain, and there is definitely corporate espionage going on, right? For the most part, they share one common goal. They want to get to or disrupt your data, your crown jewels, and their motivations are slightly different, but from an external perspective, they usually have the same hurdles to overcome before they get to, your most important data. First, they have to, find, weaknesses in your armor, and then get a foothold in your environment, usually elevating their privileges and getting to the good stuff, right? They have to fight their way past your perimeter security features, such as your firewalls and other systems you may have set up, before bending around your network segmentation and, threat mitigation tools that you may have in place. And then once they find those crown jewels, they then have to infiltrate the system itself that data is on, and get enough access rights to allow for maybe addition, modification, and deletion activity to take place. So basically, if you have security folks and they're doing their job well, it's often tough for the bad guys to get in. Sometimes that level of effort is just not worth it. So they move on to the next company, which is great, right? That's what we want to see. Today, we're not really diving deep into cybersecurity. We're not diving deep into the external threat. Today, I want to look at this again, but from the internal perspective. Unlike those, external bad guys who need to demonstrate all sorts of hacking kung fu to get what they want, you've already equipped insiders with everything that they need to bypass your firewalls, slide by a lot of the security solutions, and potentially go unnoticed by your threat identification and mitigation tools. Do you know what that is? It's a username and a password. Yep, you've given your employees the ability to get to those crown jewels. And unlike the bad guys, all they have to do is worry about getting the data out, right? They don't have to worry about getting in. They've already got the tools to get inside. So today, that's definitely what we're looking at, is stopping the flow of your intellectual property from your internal employees from leaving. Okay, so intellectual property of this nature used to be paper-based. However, most of it is now digital. It's stored electronically and accessed with many of the digital devices we use on a daily basis. Our laptops, our cell phones, whatever. We use tons of devices these days. And since most investigations focus on establishing the if and how someone did what they're suspected of doing, knowledge of common methods used to remove sensitive data is vital to today's investigative professionals. So some of the more common methods include, the email, webmail, portable messaging, instant messaging, cloud storage, and secure websites. Ken mentioned a lot of those things in that nice diagram that show all the different avenues of digital devices. So there's lots of intellectual property that you can see on the screen here, such as your customer information, staff information, business plan, trade secrets. This is all things that need protecting. And there are lots of ways that your employees can take this out of your organization, unfortunately. So those common threat vectors that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, those are the things that we as digital forensic practitioners, we look for. And we're trying to see if there's any evidence of this stuff walking out the door. So how does internal theft factor into the current business landscape? We've compiled some data and looked at a bunch of other studies that looked at not only internal theft factors, but also businesses that had various cyber incidents. And the thing that we keep seeing over many, many years is the number of incidents are rising year over year. And some stats that I saw were about 80% of organizations had a significant incident. And that term incident, does describe both insider threats and external threats. But about 80% had an incident in 2021. 32% of those organizations had more than 50 incidents alone, right? That's a lot for an organization to handle. And 49% of all the incidents related to some sort of intellectual property theft. Again, we're looping in the external threat with the internal threat and looping them all together. But still, almost 50% of those incidents involve a company's intellectual property. So obviously, we can see how valuable this is for not only insiders, but outsiders as well. So that 49% is a very, very scary number to see. So what are the sources of internal intellectual property theft? Well, obviously the biggest source, about 34%, is your current employees, right? They have the most access to your information currently right now with that username and password that I just mentioned earlier, right? So they're the ones that are there, they're currently working for you, and their day-to-day activity involves them looking at this or using this intellectual property. Then we've got former employees. And the challenge here is they may still have login credentials for things like webmail, or they may have friends still inside the company. And we've seen that as well. We've seen collusion with former employees and people that they're still working for. And when I say also that they may still have login credentials for webmail, I've been involved with companies, and I've seen in my investigations as well over the years that sometimes when an employee is let go or they leave on their own, let's say it's the 5th of the month, a lot of times their access to webmail may not be shut down till the end of the month. I've seen some protocols where IT departments we'll go through at the end of every month and limit access to those people who are now gone, right? Well, that gives somebody, right, a long time to potentially still be getting into, their webmail or whatnot, or accessing certain places, when they shouldn't be. The other one is current contractors, right? Often contractors are given access to a wide amount of information at our organizations and are usually not monitored as much as current employees. And this is a challenge. We're bringing third-party vendors or third-party contractors into organizations, and they are not, privy to all the monitoring tools that we put on all of our employees, monitoring their internet history or emails or whatnot, anything else you may have in place. A lot of times these vendors or third-party contractors are not being monitored as much. So a bit of a concern there as well. And again, just like former employees, we have former contractors. And with a lot of former contractors, they may still know how to get into your organization and get that info. Again, if we haven't been very, very careful about shutting down, their ability to get into our systems. So something to be very careful of. And we see this a lot, the current contractors and former contractors, specifically when we're talking about IT, right? If you have a third-party IT company that's managing all of your IT, if you don't have in-house IT, this is where we see this a lot, because your IT people, normally know the entire infrastructure. They've maybe helped set it up, right? They know, they've got admin rights in certain places in your organization. They have, lists of passwords to be able to get in. Right. So this is where we see a lot of intellectual property theft, is with external ITs. Okay, so what are the causes for IP theft? And before I jump into this, I'm going to tell you a little story again. I like telling stories in my presentation. I had a friend that worked for a large software company, different friend than the first story. And this friend of mine was based in Canada and worked for an organization that was based out of the US. And she worked from home for about 9 or 10 years, was one of only a few employees in Canada working for a US-based company. And during her work, she often ran out of room on her work-issued laptop. And she asked her manager if he was okay with her purchasing an external hard drive to put more things from the server down, because she was constantly pulling down things from their server and running out of room. And it was becoming very, very challenging. So the manager approved a hard drive, and she went and purchased, a hard drive. and then promptly downloaded tons of material from the company server over a weekend, right? Lots. I think it was about a 2 terabyte hard drive, which is a lot of space. Pulled a lot of things down from the server, put on this hard drive, and it made her life a lot easier. As she was going through her day-to-day activities, she wasn't running out of space. And as she was doing demos for clients, it wasn't, causing as many hiccups. So it worked really, really well. Fast forward almost 2 years, and she resigns from the company. Okay. Fast forward another year, and she found the hard drive in a box, realizing that she had almost 2 terabytes of the company's data. She wasn't sure what to do, right? So she contacted the company and said, I've still got this. What should I do? And, she said, I've also got a friend who can forensically, wipe that drive for you. And they said, that's fine. Right. So she gave the drive to me and we ran it through some tools and completely forensically wiped it, multiple times. So there was nothing left on that hard drive. But the moral of the story here is that there was no tracking with inside of her organization. She did get the approval to download that drive and download all the material, purchase the drive. But there was no tracking of that after the fact. After she left, nobody really knew that she had all this company data sitting there. So obviously that wasn't malicious, but still, it was something of concern. So again, this one was accidental, right? Which is rarely part of an investigation. It still should be addressed via your organizational controls, though. You should have a record, right? If you do allow your employees to download, data to a USB drive or some sort of external drive of some sort, or cloud storage or something, you should have a record of that. So if the employee does ever leave, we know to ask for that device back. Or better yet, right, have your IT department, purchase that drive and, especially in today where people are working virtually from home, ship it to that person. And then at least it's on the record. It's a corporately owned device that you can then ask for back, right? A lot easier to do that than, having the employee just go off and purchase it on their own. We'll talk a little bit later about BYOD, which is bring your own device, which is a whole other beast. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the other cause of intellectual property theft is obviously intentional theft, which is what we're here to talk about today. And there's basically, there's lots of reasons why somebody would steal intellectual property, but the 3 main ones are financial motivation, right? And maybe they can get money for that, or, their next, job is going to be a larger role or a salary increase, at their next job, or maybe they're disgruntled, right? Or maybe, some sort of coercion, right? A bribe or a threat. The other one we see a lot, which may or may not be intentional. It's might be an intentional theft, but maybe, not malicious in nature, is a lot of people think that the data that they generate when they're at your company is theirs, right? Presentations, or if they're a developer and they're developing code, right? I've seen a lot of intellectual property thefts where people are like, but I built that, right? It was mine. I developed that code, right? And they took that code with them as they left, right? So a bit of a challenge there. And then, obviously it's not. You did that while you were employed for the company. So a little bit of a challenge there. Okay, some common timing of intellectual property theft. On the last slide, I mentioned the 3 main intentional causes of IP theft. And the first 2, right, being disgruntled and financial, have similar timing as to when the theft of IP occurs. Most of the timing revolves around the employee either resigning or being terminated, as you can see on the screen here. So resigning, what I've seen in my history of doing these investigations over many, many years is approximately, a month or 2, before the person gives their notice, they will start to gather data or start to look around at data, right? Other things on your server, or they're gathering it. They're maybe taking things off the server and they're putting them in a folder on their desktop or something like that. We start to see that type of activity. And then if they do stick around after they resign, and sometimes that happens, right? People give notice and they give 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I've seen after somebody resigns all the way up to 6 months notice, right? They may take some data after that resignation. It's not as common after resignation because a lot of people think that there are, more controls or more monitoring going on their systems after they resign. Which often there isn't, right? But people may have that perception. And then I did mention before that after they leave, so after they're actually officially gone, a lot of times systems are left open. For example, logging into their webmail or logging into your entire Microsoft environment, which include, accessing OneDrive or whatnot, right? There's lots of places that somebody could access. So that's a real challenge. When somebody leaves, their access to everything should be shut down right away and not left open until the end of the month. Okay, and then I mentioned termination, right? If an employee suspects that they may be terminated, and sometimes that happens, again, they may start gathering data prior to their termination, especially like I mentioned, if they think that that data is technically theirs, that they created it and it's their property. And again, similar to resigning, if they leave and their systems are left open, especially if they're terminated, they might be a little disgruntled and try to get back in, right? Theft for reasons of coercion, I mentioned that before, can often happen at any time. Right? It's challenging to look at coercion because it's not really associated coercion to any sort of resignation or termination, right? If somebody is being coerced into, taking company data, that can happen at any time. So it's a little bit more challenging to look at the timing of that from a coercion perspective. Okay, I'm going to give a few examples here, and these are some scenarios that I've worked on over the years and just sort of paint a little bit of a picture for you. So I did one example. I had a C-suite employee that was suspected of doing some wrongdoings, and the employee was terminated, and I was working with the IT department and their internal fraud department. The employee handed in his device 2 days after termination. So he was a remote employee. I think he came into the office a little bit. This was some years ago. So it's interesting. We're back to that scenario now where people are working remotely more often. So he was remote and they got his device back 2 days after the fact. The fraud department gave the laptop to me and said, here's our scope. We want you to look for all this suspected wrongdoing. And when I jumped into, I started looking forensically at the hard drive, it was completely forensically wiped. And I'm not talking just about, files being deleted. There was no operating system on it. There was basically nothing on it. The only thing that was there, what I was able to find, was a tiny little timestamp that showed that it was basically wiped a few hours before he gave it back. And this is not challenging to do, right? There's actually articles out there that I've read where you can just Google how to forensically wipe my laptop and people can follow the steps, right? It's not hard to do. So it's very, very careful or have to be very aware that somebody can do this. Right now, it is damaging, right? If somebody is fired and they're suspected of doing something bad, and they hand you back the laptop and it's completely forensically wiped, and they've destroyed your company data, there's obviously going to be some questions asked, right? And legal counsel may get involved, and some other things may happen. But what's more damaging, right? It's being suspected of bleeding company data, or being suspected of stealing company data and potentially doing a whole bunch of other things as well. So a little bit of a challenge here, and we're going to talk about some methods to get around this example. The second example, we had an IT employee, internal IT, again, suspected of some wrongdoings. And he deleted important information and he removed devices. He was using USB drives and removing things. Again, the employee was terminated in this situation, and we did forensic analysis going back 3 years, which is quite a lot of time, across many, many devices. And again, unfortunately, didn't find the smoking gun that our client was looking for. These types of initiatives and insider threats have been something that has been talked about for a long time. And there's been lots of government initiatives to protect intellectual property. Here is, and then this is going back, as you can see, many years to 2015, and it is an FBI intellectual property theft article that they brought out. And you can see here, they were talking about, all sorts of things that you need to do to be looking at the insider threat and, just in general, protecting your valuable intellectual property. And I've highlighted that one part there, and that is developing an insider threat program. A lot of the other things they talk about are more safeguarding your data against external threats, but developing that insider threat program is very, very important. So again, this is something we've been talking about for a long time. The FBI, whoops, sorry, went back. The FBI also talked about some digital behaviors that you might be able to look into, or maybe not just digital behaviors, but just behaviors of somebody that you think might be suspected, or you might suspect is taking intellectual property. So again, the first one here is without authorization, they take, proprietary information home via a thumb drive or email, right? So they're sending it to themselves, or they're sending it to their home address via email, or they're plugging things in. You might not know this though, without, doing a forensic analysis, but oftentimes in our investigations, we'll see this, right? We see USB drives being plugged in, data being transferred over, or we definitely see the emails being transferred to a home address. And the other thing is somebody may, inappropriately seek or obtain proprietary classified information on subjects not related to their work duties. So they're constantly trying to, see what else is out there at your organization. They might be interested in matters outside the scope of their duty, particularly those of interest to business competitors, right? We see this sometimes where, people in the organization are trying to, feign interest in other areas and trying to see the data that's out there. So just be a little bit careful about that one. They might remotely access the computer while on vacation, sick leave, or at other odd times. We've seen this a lot with, IT people or other people that, know how to potentially, maybe set up remote accessing on your systems. If you allow that sort of thing, you can shut those down from a cybersecurity perspective. We have seen this before where people are logging in weird hours at night on weekends and doing things on the network remotely, right? They're not there in your office for you to see them. But they're definitely doing it after hours, which is a little bit of a concern. They might disregard any company policies that you might have on installing software or different hardware, bringing in their own devices when they're not supposed to, accessing restricted websites or conducting unauthorized searches or downloading confidential information. I guess the question here for you would be do you have, computer policies around all of these things? And if you don't, let's chat after this investigation. We can certainly help you with that. But every organization should have policies, about how their employees and people use their systems and their computers. So I think that's a very important one as well. And then they work odd hours. This is kind of similar to the remote accessing. They might work odd hours without, authorization, or, very, very enthused to be working overtime hours or weekends when they know other people aren't there, or unusual schedules. Hey, can I come in later and leave late? Things like that, right? These FBI behavior indicators were more sort of geared towards the 9 to 5 in the office type environment. Now, right, the way we're working in today's remote work environment, a lot of this is thrown at the mix. People are working sort of whatever hours they want. It's a little bit more open. They're working from home. They are remote accessing our systems a little bit more. So it's a little bit more challenging to see some of these behaviors. Okay, so we've painted the picture here a little bit about IP theft, when it happens, when it occurs. So now let's dive into, what can be done about this, right? And, some of the digital forensic techniques that we use during our investigations, and most of our investigations are reactive, but there's also some techniques that we can use that are proactive in nature to really help mitigate the theft of a company's IP before it even happens. Because my feeling is if we can stop it from walking out the door, it's easier than having to go to litigation, and lawyers are involved and costs go up, and it just becomes a lot messier. So let's see what we can do before it happens. Again, so mitigating and investigation through digital forensic techniques. So just sort of reiterating a little bit of the things that Ken mentioned, what are some of the relevant digital forensic techniques? He talked about identification of different devices, capturing those devices, preserving them, let's see, processing them. We take any evidence that we have and any systems that we get, and we run it through various digital forensic tools that we use, and we can process that evidence and try to see a user's activity or what they were doing, or reconstitute deleted content. That's always a big one as well. If somebody steals company data, they try to then delete a lot of their activity. We can try to reconstitute some of that. And there's some factors involved there, depending on our success. Then we jump into an analysis and we start sort of connecting all the dots together. And this is what they were doing, and this is where they went, and their internet search history, and then they deleted some things. We're building that timeline for you as we go along. And then obviously reporting. Most of this is done proactively as part of our investigations, but there's a few things on here that we can do, reactively, but a few things we can do proactively. So one thing that we can do is we cross-reference activities during our investigations. And we can do this proactively as well. And I'll get to that in a minute. But as you can see here on the screen, this is a screenshot of one of the tools that we use where we can see activity in relation to certain things. So as you can see on the screen, there's like some Skype chat messages and some file transfers with Skype around the same time as PDF documents were accessed and Dropbox was accessed and some USB devices were accessed. So when I start to look at this as that sliver, I start to see as an investigator, interesting. There's a lot of things going on at once that could involve either locations of intellectual property or potentially somebody taking intellectual property, right? USB drives, Dropbox, and maybe sending something to somebody via Skype chat message. The other thing we can do, and I mentioned this before, is we can check an employee's activity during off work hours. You can see in this example another picture of a tool that we've used. You can see, starting quite late in the day, lots of activity, not so much during the day. So you'd have to be sitting there saying, what was this person doing all day long? But after work hours, a flurry of activity, things going on. So were they staying late after work and then doing a whole bunch of bad things after work? I don't know. But basically, when we see something like this and let's say their normal workday was 9 to 5, it's just an area. Let's go take a deeper dive into this time frame and see exactly what they were doing, because it's just a little bit outside of the norm. We can then compare data over time. Right. I did mention when somebody was resigning or termination, there are different time areas there, sort of 1 month before and after, they're being let go. So we can compare that data over time if we have those sources. And we'll talk a little bit about that. We can compare data from multiple sources. So again, if we think that there's, potentially, collusion within your company, maybe more than one person, we can compare data from various sources, which might allow, us to figure out if people were working together on this, or if it was one person used maybe somebody else's account or whatnot to take, to steal intellectual property. We've seen that before in the past where, one person has had somebody else's login credentials, but, so we can look at their device, but then they're logging into somebody else. We've seen that a lot of time as IT can do things like that as well. Okay, so what can be done? As I mentioned in that article by the FBI, businesses should develop an insider threat program. And these programs can incorporate many aspects from monitoring activity to employee training, all the way through to full investigations. However, there are some things to consider before implementing any sort of insider threat program. My feeling is big brother tactics are often not the best methods. Once again, we come back to this saying, trust but verify. And companies need to pay a certain amount of trust or play a certain amount of trust, have trust in their employees. And many employees know that, things like their emails or web activity can and may be monitored. However, doing a deeper dive into everything that somebody is doing on their system, all the time may breed an atmosphere of untrust. But that's up to you and how you want to run your company, obviously. So, we often work in our little silos as investigators, and we only get involved with other internal teams when there is a need, right? Such as a network breach or, IP theft, like we're talking about today. My feeling is be proactive and form working teams to help, not only mitigate the insider threat against your company IP, but they can also act very quickly if there is an incident. And you can see on the screen here, here's just some common, teams so that might be within your environment. And some of these might be internal and some of them might be external. So your IT department, if you have anybody doing security for you, obviously a digital forensic team, if you have a fraud department or an HR team, and legal, obviously. It's especially important if a lot of these teams are external. It's really important for us to maybe meet ahead of time and develop a bit of an incident response plan, right? So how are we going to respond as all of us if we need to go and respond to an incident after the fact, right? But there's a lot of things that we can be doing before these threats happen as well. So some questions that this team will help and that you need to think of as well, right? Who has access to your information and who do you suspect is taking the data, right? As any part of your investigation. What information do your employees have access to? And what avenues do they have access to, right? We do see in a lot of smaller businesses that people have access to everything, right? Which is very, very challenging. My feeling is we should be segmenting the data that's only important for somebody to do their job, right? If it's HR, they might not need access to everything, financial, or they might not need access to sales records, right? If it's a salesperson, they might not need access to HR, for example. So we should be segmenting that data. Why would somebody take company data with them? We talked about some of those reasonings before. When do you think this has happened? Right, that's very important as investigators if we are coming in to help you with this. And how do we think they took it? So these are all questions that if you do have an incident that you should be sort of thinking about. So there's some things that we can do, some levels of digital forensics in an insider threat program. And there's data capture, there's a quick look, which we normally do during interviews, and then there's a deep dive. So let's talk about each one of those. So a data capture. There's a report that comes out every year by Verizon, and it's basically a breach report, talks about insider threats and external threats, and it's a great report. You can look it up. And there's a quote from the 2016 version of this report, which I love. It says, "Love your employees, bond at the company retreat, bring in bagels on a Friday, but monitor the heck out of their authorized daily activity, especially ones with access to such data as financial accounts, personal identifying information, payment cards, medical records, etc." Right? So I think that's very, very important that we should be monitoring people that have access to, the really important stuff, the crown jewels of our organizations. However, might we be missing anything by only monitoring employee activity? So that first example that I gave you of the C-suite employee that was suspected of doing some wrong things, they were monitoring him. Right. And they did see some weird things, through the monitoring. And then when they gave us that laptop back, it was completely forensically wiped. So what we've done, and we did for that company for a while, is we acquired devices, we periodically gathered evidence, and we safeguarded. So for people that had access to highly valuable intellectual property, we would come in random times throughout the year, and we would just take a potential image of their entire hard drive. And the company would store it, or we could store it for the company. There's lots of options there. And then we would have that for some time. And if there was ever a matter that arose, we would have that historical look to go back on. Right. So I mentioned earlier about being able to compare data over time. And like I said, some of our clients have had us image those, whatnot, so we can keep. So a quick look. Exit interviews are a great way to learn about why an employee is leaving and ways that your company can improve, obviously, to try to retain employees. However, it can also be used to help determine if an employee may have taken, company IP with them. HR staff can ask questions to learn more about where the employee has kept company data. Did they take anything home, on what devices, and when? I mentioned that story of a friend of mine with that hard drive. If during her exit interview, she was asked, "Okay, we've got your laptop. Was there any other devices that you shared, that you stored company intellectual property on or company data on?" She might have remembered, "Oh yes, I've also got this hard drive. Great, we need that back," right? Rather than waiting till years down the road. So when an exit interview is being conducted, and if warranted, digital forensic practitioners can discreetly do a quick review on the employee's device look for any indicators of IP theft. I showed you that slide before with some of the common indicators, USB usage, maybe some cloud storage or some other avenues. We can come in during exit interviews, do a very quick, sort of very high level search to see if we have any activity of that, and relay that to, your internal HR team or others and say, there's a few things here that you might want to dive deeper into because it looks like there might have been some usage around the time a month before or whatnot. So it just gives your organization a little bit more information to go on during the interviews. And then if needed, you can conduct a deeper dive into the evidence. And, this is normally done reactively after the fact. It's normally not done before somebody's leaving, just because it does take a lot longer in duration than the quick look. But as I mentioned, we can do, recovering deleted content. We rebuild sort of the evidence. We compare those artifacts. We paint the picture and we build you that timeline as to really what happened over time. So that's a much deeper dive, but, so obviously there's the proactive side and there's the reactive side to this. Okay, so where possible, be proactive rather than just being reactive. I think it's important to think of both, right? But from my perspective, most companies are reactive and they're waiting till somebody leaves. And then they're like, wait a minute, it looks like there's some weird things going on here. It's always best before somebody leaves, just give us a call. Have a conversation. Obviously, legal counsel may or may not be involved, your HR team, all that insider threat team. There's potentially different people on that team that you might want to have a conversation with before somebody leaves. I would make programs like this part of your corporate culture and adapt security and acceptable use policies and other related policies accordingly. And I would be transparent and let employees know that their systems, are likely being monitored, or there's various aspects that are being monitored, and activity on those systems may be looked at a deeper level when they are leaving the company. The companies that I see do this the best really bake this in, and they have a culture of security. And they tell employees right from the very beginning, we take protecting our intellectual property very, very seriously here at our company. And, throughout your whole time here, there's going to be certain, things that we're going to be doing. And because we need to really make sure that our it's the bloodline of our company. We can't have it walking out the door. All right. So be transparent about that. Okay. And with that, I'm going to take a nice big deep breath. And that was a lot to go through today. We did get some questions that were asked during the registration period. So we have taken a few of those, and we're going to go through a few. And then if there's time left after we answer some of those, and I see there's also some in the Q&A, we're going to try to get through as many as we can. However, like I said at the very beginning of this presentation, if we don't get to them all, please reach out, or we'll reach out to you if you have some questions, and let's have a further conversation, because I definitely don't want to leave anybody hanging here. Okay, so, and I think Ken and I are both going to be answering some of the questions here. So I'll just jump into the first one. Somebody said, where is digital forensics most effective when it's used proactively or reactively? Well, I think I just sort of went through that a little bit. I think there's a great combination of both. Like I said, I think there are things that you can be doing, some very simple processes that you can be putting into place proactively. The most important thing I think you should have there is that insider threat team, people that you can call and just have that conversation with to develop a bit of a game plan, and then, have that incident response plan. If something does happen, you're not scrambling, trying to find, vendors or other people. Have everybody ready. I think that's really, really important. And then if needed, reactively, if you do need to do a deeper dive and do a deeper investigation, everybody's there, they're ready to go, right? So I think that's really, really important. Okay, the second one here, and maybe I'll give this one to Ken. How can someone determine if an employee is covertly engaging in corporate espionage and sending confidential data to a third party?
So I think there's two aspects to that question, Ryan. The first aspect is the FBI behavioral issues that you mentioned in one of your previous slides. So if the employee is, remoting in when they don't normally remote in, or if they're accessing the network during their vacation, or if they're doing stuff on their computer at odd hours that you wouldn't expect, like middle of the night or something like that. The clues like that can help you clue in on whether or not something weird is happening. The other aspect of this answer is, the forensic tools. So you could have things like file auditing turned on. I think that's a feature that Microsoft has. Your administrator can turn on file auditing. There's also cyber tools you could use, like web traffic monitoring. So you can see if any files are leaving the company and stuff like that. Or if you see on your firewall, if you see like large data transfers, then that could be like indication of stuff that's leaving the company that's not really desirable. But yeah, basically those are the two aspects that I would look at.
Thanks, Ken. That's great. Okay, another question. Does a company have the right to forensically examine an employee's own device? That's a good one. So again, we go back to the bring your own device policy. This is really challenging. And over the years, I've had many investigations where it's obviously a company-owned device. The company can get it back, and we can do our investigation on it. Bring your own devices are very, very challenging. And obviously, I'm not legal counsel and not giving legal advice here. And that this is definitely a question where you should be talking to legal counsel. It can be very, very challenging, to have an employee give their own personal device back. So it's one of the reasons why I normally recommend companies don't have a bring your own device policy. In case something happens down the road, but that's challenging for a lot of smaller companies that sort of have to do that. A lot of companies do also now, especially on personal cell phones, they do put it's called an MDM, so mobile device monitoring tools on that phone. So at least they have some access to their company's property that's on their phone, emails and other things like that, and they could shut down access very, very quickly. But again, that won't give the company, access to that device to do a deeper dive after the fact. So BYOD can be very, very challenging. The only times as well that we see a BYOD aspect, and Ken mentioned this earlier, is if we do an investigation and we see potentially personal USB drives or other things, or maybe devices being sent personally to somebody's home, or we see evidence of a personal nature. We often are involved in something called an Anton Pillar order, as Ken mentioned, and that's a civil search warrant. Right, lawyers get involved, and we go and the lawyers serve the person with this civil search warrant. And then, it gives us the right, or gives the lawyer the right to ask for any devices, that person may own that may be containing company intellectual property. So we have had situations with those Anton Pillar orders where we have seized a lot of somebody's personal devices to look at, but that's, the nuclear option, as lawyers like to call it, right? That's further down the road in litigation matters. Okay, another one for Ken here. Can you recover deleted data from any device?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we get that a lot, actually, because people delete stuff unintentionally all the time. I would say that it depends on the device. If you lost your photos on your SD card in your camera, yes, we can usually undelete those, and I've done that successfully in the past for coworkers. If it's files off of like a relatively recent laptop that uses an SSD drive, the chances of recovery are a little bit slimmer because of the way SSDs work. For older laptops with conventional hard drives, we can typically undelete stuff. As you may know, when something's deleted, a flag is just changed in the master file table to show that's been deleted, but the actual content is still there in most cases, unless it's been overwritten by new data. So if you have a hard drive that's constantly almost full all the time, it'll have to definitely purge old data to be able to write new data. But if you have a hard drive that's mostly empty, then there's probably still a lot of deleted data still there intact that could be recovered, but it depends.
Yeah, that's a typical answer for us. Unfortunately, in the digital forensic realm is it depends. And then we get into cell phones, and again, it depends on this type of cell phone and storage size. So, but great answers there. I completely agree with you, Ken. Another one, how can I protect my most important data? Again, that's sort of one of the main themes today. I didn't dive today into cybersecurity measures that you can take, things that you can be putting in place from a cyber perspective. If you are concerned about that, want to chat about that, please reach out. I'll introduce you to our cyber team. There are lots of things you can be doing. We did mention a few of them today. Ken was mentioning firewalls, and then, different systems that look at, large amounts of data transfers. And there's a whole bunch of other things you can be doing. I did also mention data segmentation, right? There's a whole bunch of things, multi-factor authentication, endpoint detection and response tools. And I won't get into everything today because that's a whole other presentation in itself. But please, if you're concerned about that, reach out. Today's presentation, again, was mostly about how digital forensics itself can be done in a little bit of a proactive way and reactive. But a lot of people don't really think of it. They think of forensics as always after the fact, right? We're doing an investigation later, where some of the tools and some of the techniques that we do can also protect your important data. Okay, we've got a few more minutes here, about 4 minutes. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A. So there's a bunch here, which is great. And I'll either answer some, or maybe I'll turn them over to Ken. Can terminated employees take copies of emails they sent using their company email address and send them to their personal email account? Complaint they made to managers and other employees. Well, again, I guess the question there is, well, yes, right? So when somebody is terminated, did you turn off access to them, getting into their Office 365 or their email environment? Right. If you've turned that off, then the chances of them not being able to get back in to send something to themselves is likely gone. But if they still have access to that, there's really not a lot stopping somebody from potentially emailing to a home account or some other account that they've set up. Or, right, you can take an email on Outlook or other programs, and you can just save that one email. You can basically drag it off into your desktop, right? And it saves it as an EML file or another type of file. And you can store that onto a thumb drive or whatnot. So there's lots of ways that employees can be taking emails. But that's from Nadia. Thank you so much, Nadia, for the question. All right, anonymous attendee. Do you think when an employee decided to leave for another company, should we let her or him go at once instead of having them wait 2 to 3 weeks as per their resignation letter? We don't want to give them opportunities to steal our intellectual property. Well, that's a great question, right? And I think that's really the one we're talking about today. It's that trust but verify. Again, we want to put trust in our employees. And again, I think it depends on that employee and your relationship with that employee, and maybe some of the activities that employees doing. If you saw them doing some of the behavioral things that I mentioned in that FBI post, you may be like, this is a little weird, they're resigning. Or, it totally depends. If they're, going to a competitor, maybe you might want to take a look and say, no, we don't want to, give them 2 weeks. So that's totally up to you, but there's a lot of factors there involved. It really depends. If they, need 2 or 3 weeks to, close down client files or transfer things over, they might need some time. So it might be detrimental for you to, have somebody leave right away. You might have a lot of clients or whatnot that are sort of left hanging. Okay, another one from Nadia. Great. What areas should employers be monitoring? Do we have to disclose all areas that we're monitoring? So this is kind of a two-parter. There's lots of areas that you can be monitoring. We've mentioned a few today, like their internet history, their emails, large file downloads. I know a lot of organizations will not allow, internet browsers to go to any sort of cloud storage, Dropbox or Sync or others. I know that a lot of organizations will lock down USB drives and not allow them. Things like that. Or if you do allow USB drives, they have to be secured, encrypted with BitLocker or something else like that. So there's lots of areas that you can be monitoring your employees. From a disclosing perspective, I think that's probably a question you might want to talk to legal counsel. I don't know if I should be answering that one because I don't really know the answer to that one. Back to anonymous attendee. What if it's the same one? We use Dropbox for storage. Do you know of any software or tools that we could use to allow staff to access data, but not copy to a local drive? Yeah, there are lots out there. That might be another question I can follow up. Again, I don't know who you are.
Sorry. I looked up that one when you were presenting.
Sure.
So the answer to that is, if you share a link with Dropbox, you can set it to read only and prevent them from copying it down to your local drive. If you share out a folder, then you can't do that. Yeah. Nothing stops you from copying stuff from out of a folder. So if you want to lock it down more, share it as a link instead.
And there are lots of other tools out there that are designed to be a cloud storage device, or a cloud storage application that are more for protecting intellectual property and are more for business use. Some of them have full auditing capabilities where you can see every single file that was touched by every single user and what they were doing with it. So please reach out. Happy to share some of those with you, but there are lots of different options out there. Okay, we've got another few questions here, but we're slowly running out of time. So I'll try to answer a few more. How would you see an employee sending an email to themselves? What if they sent it from their personal account or on a free guest Wi-Fi? Well, again, a lot of that would have to be done, through forensic manner, or if you have, some sort of logging set up or rules set up in your email programs, right? You can talk to your IT person about that, but often that's challenging to see. And if somebody's using their free guest Wi-Fi, again, if they're logging into your corporate device or your corporate account, even from their guest Wi-Fi, it really doesn't matter which Wi-Fi they're on. They're still logging into your system. This is a great one from Brandon. Thank you so much. How would you prevent an employee from taking pictures of information using a personal cell phone? You really can't, right? I can pull up my cell phone right now and take a picture of the screen. That's really, really challenging. So that's a really hard one. And I think, one of the slides I mentioned about some of the common threat vectors of how people do this, that's definitely a way that people do this. And that's probably one of the most challenging ones. Another one, Teresa, what grounds do we have if they use personal phones for our business? Well, again, that's up to you, right? Are you a bring your own device policy organization, or are you have to use, corporate devices? Right? Or maybe a mixture of both. Some organizations are both. So again, that's totally up to your policies and how you choose to do things. My feeling would be there, if you are allowing somebody to use personal phones, please do, install tools on those phones. Like I said, MDM tools, mobile device management tools, if you have them on those devices, to at least be able to, somewhat control the intellectual property and emails and other things like that. And then the last one here from anonymous attendee again, I was interested in protecting my own work from being and distributed by outsiders, especially if I'm sending my training to companies. Is there anything you can help with for that? For example, how can I tell if someone is downloading and saving and sharing my training materials? Again, you can lock down. I'm not sure the question here. Maybe you might have to reach out. Is this an insider? It's an outsider thing. So if somebody is outside is saving and sharing your training materials, that's a challenging one. Obviously, your training materials is still intellectual property, and there are certain things that you can do to lock down, even things that you are sharing externally. You can have watermarks, or you can have, if it's a PDF file, you can have passwords on it, or you can stop it from being shared or whatnot. There's certain things you can do there. However, if it's something that you publicly give out, it can be really challenging, for somebody not to, take wording out of that or the things like that. That might be something, we can certainly help you from that, from a file perspective, but that might be a good question as well, to speak to counsel about. So, and with that, I think we're done. It's a few minutes after the hour. I greatly appreciate everybody sticking around for the extra few minutes. Again, if you have any other questions, please reach out. Our contact information is here on the screen for both Ken and I. And speaking on behalf of Ken and myself, it's been an absolute pleasure being here today. We thank you all for coming out, and we hope you have a wonderful day.